Good morning. We'll get started in about 45 seconds or so. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name's Eric Daly. I'm the Managing Principal of Multnomah Group, welcome to today's webinar, Is My Plan Working? Easy Ways to Evaluate Plan Success. And I'm going to further subtitle the presentation, Making Sure Your Defined Contribution Plan Wins Lots of Awards. So this is the blueprint for creating a retirement plan that is indeed award-worthy as we move into the retirement plan award season. A couple of housekeeping items before I get started today. The first of which is we're recording today's presentation, and as a result, to hopefully create clear audio quality, we've muted the lines. That said, we do encourage participation and questions throughout. If you look at the GoToWebinar presentation or the screen to the right, typically of your screen, you'll see the opportunity to both ask questions or chat. We're happy to take those throughout the presentation or at the conclusion if we're unable to get to them. Second issue, we will be distributing a copy of today's slides electronically, probably within the week, so that you'll have an opportunity to have those notes, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes during today's presentation. The third of which is, because we're recording the presentation, if you have the need or wish to share it with others within your office or organization, do feel free to do so. We'll have a copy of that available to you as well. So as I get into today's presentation, I just want to start with why this issue has become so interesting, I think, to our firm and necessary, frankly, to retirement plan sponsors. Clearly, over the course of the last 3 decades, we've seen a tremendous shift in how retirement benefits work at the employer level, both in for-profit, not-for-profit, and in governmental entities. We moved from what had been a predominantly defined benefit model to a nearly exclusively, in many cases, defined contribution model. And under the defined benefit model, measuring the health or success of your retirement plan was relatively simple. The actuary would give you a report card at the end of the year that would declare the funding status of the plan, measuring the future liabilities of your workforce against the asset pool that you had accumulated. You clearly could benchmark the performance of the investment pool because it was determined and driven by the decisions of the retirement committee. And those two metrics alone would give you a tremendous insight into how healthy and well run your retirement plan was. The challenge, of course, being that that certainty from a participant perspective came with a tremendous amount of volatility from an employer perspective. So the needs from an accounting perspective, an actuarial perspective, and a PBC perspective to ensure plans were well funded made tremendous economic volatility a byproduct of running an effective defined benefit plan. As market conditions changed and interest rate objectives changed, how well funded and ultimately what the total contribution may need to be by the employer could swing dramatically from year to year. Understandably, given those economic certainties, employers moved to a defined contribution model that removed almost entirely volatility from the plan sponsor side of the ledger. However, it created a tremendous amount of volatility on the participant side of the ledger. And it also made determining the overall health of a plan much, much more difficult. In a defined benefit setting, we knew exactly what the benefit would be for any participant who met their target retirement age and consequence. In a defined contribution setting, we pick up employers in their 50s, in their 60s, in their 40s. Maybe they have a spouse who works and has a rich benefit. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're the sole income earner. Maybe they're due for a huge inheritance. Maybe they have costs and expenses that are far beyond. So determining how effectively the defined contribution plan is working has largely been ignored for much of the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s. It's really only in the last 4 to 5 years that we've seen record-keeping service providers try and pay more attention to overall plan health. So this presentation is not about why we should move back to the defined benefit model. We certainly as consultants are understanding that you have to accept reality on reality's terms, and the defined contribution model that we live in, we expect will be the predominant retirement model for the foreseeable future. However, hopefully in today's presentation, what we will do is give you an opportunity to find a few quick metrics to see how well is your plan working given your demographics and organization, and then maybe a couple of quick checks to see how can you make modifications to improve its operation and create some objectives and goals from a planning perspective going forward. You know, why is the benchmarking piece important? Well, because this transition to defined benefit to defined contribution has had consequences. One consequence is it's created less pension volatility, clearly, for employers, but it's had a tremendous amount of volatility down further the pipeline as far as employment practices and benefit costs. You know, clearly, employees with a defined benefit plan are more apt to retire on time than those in a defined contribution plan. According to the study from the University of Missouri, perhaps even 87% more likely to retire on time than in a defined contribution plan. Participants in a defined contribution plan are very closely tied to how well the S&P 500 index is performing. Clearly, when you have to work off or live off an accumulated asset base, how large the asset base is and how much you think it may rise after retirement has a tremendous impact on how confident you feel in your preparedness for retirement. And it's going to get worse. By the year 2020, 20% of the workforce is anticipated to be age 65 or older. Everyone's talking about millennials and how to serve millennials in the workforce. There may not be room for millennials, frankly, in the workforce if we can't effectively manage labor practices and be able to transition active employers into retirement on time with an effective retirement plan. And the reality is that the costs of an older workforce have been documented frequently, and while they don't show up in pension liability numbers, they do tend to show up in other places. For instance, workers' compensation, where workers' compensation claim duration is 25% longer and benefit payments are 56% higher for those employees 65 and over. Certainly shows up on the disability side, where disability premiums are 15 times higher and instances are 42% higher for participants age 65 and older. And undoubtedly, it shows up whether you're self-insured or whether you're part of a pooled insurance structure in healthcare costs, where healthcare costs for an employee 65 or older are 2x those an employee between the ages of 45 and 54. Those are meaningful cost drivers. So as that 20% of the population or the workforce by the year 2020 is 65 or older, will increase those ancillary costs that, again, don't show up on the retirement plan distribution line, but do show up in other places within the financial statement of the organization. When we look at retirement plans, we look at them on a life cycle process. And while each participant is unique, they come in with different circumstances, objectives, If you're going to evaluate a plan in a meaningful way, I think there has to be some level of categorization. And within our firm, we tend to break the participant populations into 3 camps. Certainly young savers. They tend to be, as the name would indicate, younger. Because they're younger, they tend to be lower income, and there is very direct competition for earned income. Wherever you're calling in from across the country, we've seen massive increases in housing costs, and that has had an impact on the amount of excess compensation that a young saver can feel comfortable and confident investing within a retirement plan. For that particular portion of the population, we're really trying to get 3 things accomplished. We want to get them started as quickly as is humanly possible in saving anything for retirement. We want to reward them for being engaged and being patient. And we want to affirm their commitment in starting the retirement planning process. The second population is what we call the accumulators in a defined contribution sense. They're mid-career. They tend to be highly productive. They have achieved a point of financial security where they have some confidence. And for this particular portion of the population, we want to, again, reaffirm the progress that they're making toward an ultimate retirement. We certainly want to reduce the likelihood that there will be instances that derail that preparedness. So in-service distributions, loans, hardships, and other things. And we want to begin orienting them towards what retirement looks like. Begin thinking about the possibility of retirement. The earlier that process starts, it takes a long time, frankly, for participants to become comfortable with the notion, just even psychologically, of retirement and what that is. So doing education on what it looks like, the decisions that they'll be forced to make, and how retirement can be very, very different, perhaps, than the retirement of their parents. And the last population is the pre-retiree. This is our accomplished participant population, very late career, extremely experienced. And at this point, frankly, they've concluded most of the costs of establishing a family and having a life, right? They're in their last house, and perhaps they'll even downsize at some point after this. Their kids are through school, and hopefully they have limited obligations related to their kids and their grandchildren. For this particular portion of the population, we're really fighting largely a psychological exercise in a defined contribution plan. How do we convey to participants that they are, in fact, financially able to retire? How do we convey that retirement isn't a death of sorts, right? What comes with retirement? How can they stay active and productive members of society, even if they don't happen to be working within our organization? And from our perspective, this is the population where education and resources and communication is frankly most advantageous to be spent. These particular portion of the population has very specific questions about healthcare works. They have very specific questions about how the Social Security system works. They have very specific questions about estate planning, and very typically specific goals about what they would like to see when they make it into retirement. So in looking at the life cycle of a defined contribution plan, we said, well, what are some easy metrics without looking at these massive documents? The providers across the country have begun creating much better and much more informative information for retirement committees to help them evaluate the success of their retirement plan. The problem is that the documents, as they looked at, provide tremendous amounts of data with very little context. So, for instance, some providers look at what the average replacement income will be for a participant. And, of course, the average replacement income excludes any assets that they may have outside the plan, because clearly a provider wouldn't have access to that information. It clearly excludes whatever obligations they may have to their family or a spouse who's not in the workforce, because they don't have access to that information. It focuses maybe too extensively on individual data points rather than looking at the plan in aggregate. So what we tried to come up with is really 5 very quick benchmarks that any defined contribution plan sponsor could look at to try and determine where they are from a planning perspective. So I'm going to start with that young saver population. that's beginning that retirement savings process. And we really look at two primary factors of indicating plan health here, right? Participation rate and contribution rate. And when we talk about participation rate and contribution rate, I think it's important to point out that the easiest way and the most effective way to modify or change those two numbers is through plan design, whether it's using automatic enrollment to increase the participation or the supplemental participation rate within your organization, whether it's using automatic escalation to try and increase the amount that participants are contributing toward their retirement. Certainly creating plan structures that use match features to try and incite or entice higher contribution levels among the participant population. But it's also a byproduct of what does your workforce look like? What is the average wage? What are the objectives that the plan is trying to accomplish so that we can use plan design to do that quickly? The provider marketplace and frankly other consultants in the marketplace are trying to sell a narrative that you can communicate your way through to higher participation and communication rates. And I'll talk about some data studies that would ultimately support that that's not likely to occur, right? Ultimately, design and plan structure drives quickly changes in contribution and participation rates. It's very, very difficult to do that in group settings. It's very difficult to do it in one-on-one settings in a way that's repeatable and effective for plan sponsors. So let's take a look first at the first metric, average participation rate. We took some data from Vanguard's How America Saves study for 2017 and looked at the 2016 data for contribution rates. And it supports that we've seen pretty tremendous increases in participation rates. And just for those who are not familiar, participation rate in a defined contribution setting would be the proportion of the eligible population that is electing to defer some of their own income into the retirement plan. When we look at it on a plan or participant weighted basis, so a plan weighted basis meaning the large employer is at 78% and a company with 22 employees is at 95%, those are equivalent data points. So on a plan weighted participation rate perspective, we're looking at about 81% participation. If you look at it, I think on a more relevant measure, which would be participant weighted participation rate, so of all eligible employees, what percentage are choosing to defer or electing to defer, it's 79%. The number that we tend to look at is the automatic enrollment participant weighted participation rate. So for plans with automatic enrollment, on a participant weighted basis, what portion of the population elects to defer? The answer is 90%, and that obviously compares very, very favorable for plans without automatic enrollment where the participation rate is a mere 63%. We are seeing a massive movement among employers to automatic enrollment. It is incredibly effective at driving higher participation rates. There are a number of reasons that automatic enrollment may not work within your organization, typically related to payroll structure and the difficulty of maintaining those records in a way that works and is effective and would survive an audit process. But the notion that automatic enrollment at this point is too paternalistic and is dictating plans, I think has largely been overcome. We still hear that periodically in talking to organizations, but the reality is with the number of plan sponsors adopting automatic enrollment increasing with each year, it's becoming not only more common than not that an employer would have automatic enrollment, but participants in many cases seem to favorably view automatic enrollment as an easier way for them to get into the retirement plan. What's also driving these higher participation rates is the notion that for plans with automatic enrollment, we are seeing an increasing number of plan sponsors go to an automatic annual re-enrollment, meaning that you could opt out on October 1st of 2017, and we are going to try to automatically re-enroll you on October 1st of 2018. Those types of procedures, while again difficult from a payroll perspective perhaps to implement without the partnership of your record-keeping service provider, certainly are seeing participation rates that are well north of 95%. So when we look at the structure, we say, well, if we have the right features, automatic enrollment, re-enrollment potentially, and some form of employer match contribution, I don't think that 90% participation rates are out of the spectrum. There are certainly things that would impact that. There are employers that have large decentralized manufacturing bases and where wage levels would make a 90% participation rate much more difficult. But in taking 90 as the benchmark and then adjusting based on the demographics of your organization would get you to a quick measure of plan health. It's important in looking at plans that we will never get a plan like a defined benefit plan where enrollment rates are 100% and contributions are fixed for every participant. There will always be a portion of the population that has other priorities. But getting to a 90% participation rate means the overwhelming majority of participants are engaged actively in preparing for their own retirement. The next piece is taking a look at contribution rates. There are two numbers that I hear constantly that I think to some degree may actually hurt retirement preparedness, and the first is that everybody should be prepared to replace somewhere between 80 and 100% of their income. The second is that everybody needs to save somewhere between 15 and 20% of pay. If I'm a young saver who is having a hard time saving up enough money for an apartment, and you tell me that I need to save 15 to 20% of my pay, I'm likely just going to defer saving it all, right? I can't do anything meaningful toward retirement, so why would I bother putting 2 or 3% away when I really need to get to 15 to 20%? And frankly, if I was mid-career and I'm making $85,000, $90,000 a year, and you tell me I need to be able to replace $90,000 a year for the rest of my life, increased for inflation, and I may likely think I'm never going to retire, so why should I actually participate in retirement savings? There's a really good study that I look at in the firm that was conducted by Dimensional Fund Advisors and Marlena Lee that looked at the retirement income equation, looked at a number of different data points that came to a much more realistic expectation as to what participants should be looking for in retirement. And in doing it, it said, well, everybody doesn't have the same retirement income replacement rate. If I am a lower paid employee, I am going to need to replace a much higher percentage of my pay because likely those costs are going to sustaining my lifestyle. The higher the income, on average, the lower the replacement rate I may need to live an adequate retirement because more of those expenses are optional expenses, and I may elect not to replace them when I get to retirement. The second factor, which I think is equally material, is rather than scaring participants with the eventual bankruptcy of Social Security, is being more realistic about where Social Security is today and how it replaces retirement income. Clearly, if you are of a belief that Social Security will not be there for the next generation, you should make different savings decisions. I think as we look at retirement plans in a whole, I think it's unrealistic given their current structure to expect that defined contribution plans would be able to both bridge the retirement savings gap and replace Social Security. So in looking at that, we take a look at Social Security replacement rates, and again, for employees that are making less than $26,000 a year, Social Security is likely going to replace about 60% of their income, and for them to have a adequate or average retirement, they need to save another 23% of their income. For an employee making less than $50,000 a year, they're going to get about 38% of that back from Social Security and need to augment that with an additional 34%. Under the $85,000 threshold, it's 31-31 between Social Security and savings. And clearly, the higher you get up the income equation, the lower or the less will be replaced by Social Security, and the higher the savings burden on participants. Given that data, I think each plan sponsor then needs to take a look at ultimately their demographics to say what would the right contribution mix be, and how does that fit with either our match or our discretionary contributions that we make at an employer level, and how does that complement what we are going to need participants to save from their own retirement income. And as part of that, similar part of that same study, How Much Should I Save for Retirement in 2013, they did just that. They looked and said, well, what do we need to do to get to a 40% income replacement rate? So the remainder being handled by Social Security, you need 40% of your replacement income, and it's driven, not surprisingly, by how much you make, and secondarily, how confident do you want to be about that retirement savings level, right? Most folks, when offered the prospect of, well, would you like a 50-50 chance to be able to retire, would say, well, no, they probably need to have a higher level of confidence than that. So we tend to look at the 90% confidence interval. Clearly, there will be economic circumstances for those who retired in 2007 and experienced the economic consequences of 2008 while they were having to simultaneously take distributions from their retirement account. Again, creating a absolute certainty in a defined contribution plan is a significant limitation. Defined benefit plans handle it much better because they have longer periods of time. Individually, defined contribution participants will always be subject in one way or another to some level of market risk and uncertainty related to the distribution phase. But in looking at success probability rates for income levels, you can see at a 90% confidence interval, actually 18% of pay is probably going to cover most participants earning less than $130,000 a year. And if your demographic tends to swing toward lower income earners, so call it the 100,000 level, perhaps contribution rates of 15% are adequate. And then ultimately having to make a decision as a retirement plan about, well, realistically, how can we design and drive allocations that are sufficient to meet the needs of the majority of the population. Frequently, plan sponsors will take a look at their employee population and break it out into income quartiles or income deciles and say, hey, we need to have a plan that will successfully meet the needs of the lowest 80% of our workforce from a pay and compensation perspective. And if we can get a plan that has a 50% match on the first 8% of pay, and we can get average contributions up to 7.5% of pay, well, that means that we've got a plan that's going to effectively cover any participant who is earning less than $70,000 a year and needs that 11% contribution rate. So there is no singular number, I would argue, in looking at what the amount of contribution should be at a plan level. But I do think looking at the input rather than the output is the more effective measure. You as a plan sponsor can do very little about hiring a 58-year-old who has yet to save a nickel for retirement. What we need to do is look at the plan in aggregate and say, do we create a structure where if an employee does choose to work here for 30 years, they could be and should be in a position to retire successfully and with dignity from the organization. So once we get you in, and once we've created a design structure through match, through automatic enrollment, through automatic re-enrollment that drives the needs of the participant population forward and savings rates at a targeted level that's sustainable and delivers retirement benefits, we have to look at the leakage problem, which has become more and more significant with each passing year, almost without regard to economic circumstance, with the exception of a tick in hardship withdrawals over the 2008, 2009, 2010 period. For the accumulators, what we want to try and do is avoid stagnation, avoid leakage, and really look, because the data related to hardships is pretty universal. Hardships tend to be under 1% of the. So if you've got a plan with 150 participants, you may get one hardship distribution a year. Clearly, the financial requirements of hardships are significant, and as a result, you can't really design a plan that can avoid participants finding themselves in a position. The loan issue is one that is a challenge. It's a self-made obstacle for plans, and they are massively popular among committees, plan sponsors, and in many cases participants. And it is a difficult issue to many plan sponsors once they've been extended. Once you have made plan loans available to participants, restricting them or eliminating them is a difficult process. It's further made difficult by the fact that whether your plan has loans or not is not a fiduciary function. So if you're participating in today's web meeting as a byproduct as a plan administrator or fiduciary to your retirement plan, restricting plan loans ultimately is a settler function. So one that would traditionally be handled by the board or the executive office, maybe through a recommendation by the fiduciary committee. So even committees that are concerned with making their plans more effective have the further educating the plan settlor or the sponsor as to why this issue is material and important. Again, the issue of plan loans can't actively solved through education. It really has to be through design and orientation, typically limiting the number of loans that any one participant can take, in some cases limiting the reasons that a participant would be allowed to take a loan. In some cases, it's as simple as just making loan issuance more cumbersome. Technology has made it such that a plan participant can, in many cases, with an adequate retirement balance and a good provider, may be no more than 5 or 6 clicks away from having $10,000 ACH'd into their checking account. Making that process more cumbersome, so a participant needs to be more thoughtful and potentially may look at other ways to get the same income or the same money that they may need for a circumstance or situation, can also reduce the number of loans. And then creating mechanisms for repayment post-severance. We live in a very mobile workforce that, especially among younger participants, moves from job to job with increasing velocity. And with loans that have 5-year durations, getting a participant from loan issuance to loan satisfaction in a 5-year period through payroll remittance can be a difficulty. And when they leave and still have money outstanding, how can we put them in a position where they're not having to default on that loan and accept the necessary tax and hardship, or pardon me, tax and early withdrawal penalties that come with payment? So increasingly we're seeing provider mechanisms that allow for direct ACH from a checking account so that potentially participants can continue to make loans even when they move from one organization to another. So in case you're unfamiliar, before I get into the benchmarks and metrics of what we think are kind of successful loan payment mechanisms and ways to measure to peers, it does important to kind of point out how impactful these loans can be. In most market cycles, the reality is the opportunity cost for taking a loan is high. Clearly, we've been in one of those really for the last 9 years, where repaying yourself back a 4 to 5% interest rate market that's growing at 8 to 9% a year is significant and has a significantly negative impact on accumulations and earnings over time. The second, I talked about clearly the event of job loss and tax and penalty consequences can be devastating. I've taken a loan for a home, which I think plan sponsors seem to favor. We want to allow participants to be able to buy homes. The duration on those loans is longer. The likelihood of them taking larger loans, because they're allowable, is higher. And the possibility of them leaving before satisfaction of the loan is therefore higher. And the negative consequences of those loans when not paid, when transitioning from job to job, is tremendous at the time of retirement. Borrowing today may eliminate a potential safety net for the future. One of the things we have noticed is for plan sponsors who begin restricting the number of loans, it actually does reduce the total number of loans taken, ultimately, at least theoretically, because participants always want to have the ability to take a loan in need. So if they take a loan now to satisfy what is a short-term want, they may not have resources later or the ability, because of the design feature, to take a loan when they may need one in the future. It's certainly not great for participants in communicating. I think the reality is that it does suggest that participants may be living beyond their means, and there's data to support that, plan sponsors, although unintentionally, may look at data like that. But last, and certainly from my perspective, more important, is that loan repayments can crowd out deferral contributions. So in borrowing and having to make payments through payroll, it may reduce your ability to make tax-preferred contributions to the plan, and potentially even impact your ability to fully achieve any matching contributions provided by your employer. So in taking a look at some metrics, we looked at data from the EBRI study, the Employee Benefit Research Institute, and took a look at, well, what would be some good metrics for you as a plan sponsor, looking at the accumulation population and how to limit that in-plan leakage. The first is the percentage of eligible participants with a loan outstanding. Right now, the national average is 18%. Clearly, having numbers beneath that would indicate plan health, that a small portion of our participants, again, that's nearly 1 in 5, have a loan outstanding. Reducing the number of participants as a percentage of the total eligible certainly is important. The second is for that 18% or 15% or however large the population may be, what is the average number of loans outstanding for those participants? We ultimately would like to see that number under 1.5. Many plans limit loans to 2 or 3. If we have participants that are repetitively taking loans, it indicates that A, the plan isn't working the way that was intended, right? Nobody funds a retirement plan so that they may have accessible checking resources available for participants. And the last piece is, how large are the loans as a percentage of the total participant balance? We're looking at numbers nationally that would support that participants with a loan tend to have 10% of their loan outstanding, or 10% of their account balance outstanding, pardon me. Clearly, the IRS limits the amount you can take to 50% of your vested account balance. We like to see numbers that are less than 10%. Still, 10% has a significant negative impact on returns and accumulations, but clearly numbers higher than 10% make that impact that much more detrimental. And then the last is the pre-retiree population. And I would say that the pre-retiree population is the most difficult. The needs of each one of those individuals is significantly different. Aggregating them and measuring them in a way that's meaningful from a review perspective is difficult. From an objectives perspective, we really look at 3 things. And first being is, how effective are we at helping bring their retirement plan projections to a fine point? How do we take these accumulated asset numbers and turn them into, at least psychologically, an idea as to what they could expect, should expect, and may be able to generate in retirement income? And in doing that, the complications become, we're going to have to look at external assets. We have spousal income issues. And that's when spending needs really do differ. I've showed you averages about how a participant with an age range or a wage range of X and Y may need to replace this much income. That clearly would be a byproduct of, have I paid off my house or not? Do I have healthcare needs that are higher than or not higher than? Do I have other healthcare resources provided by my employer or through Medicare to cover my likely healthcare needs as I transition into retirement? The second we need to be able to provide participants advice on how to secure and protect accumulated savings. We are seeing increasingly plans move to, especially in light of the fiduciary rule, and at least the perspective, at least pre the current administration, that the Department of Labor was interested in seeing more money accumulate in retirement plans and less of it transition into IRA accounts. How can we provide mechanisms by which participants can generate reliable retirement income out of our retirement plan? And a big piece of that is number 3, helping them transition to income planning, whether it's paid out income planning as a percentage of pay, or in some cases potentially annuitizing some portion of the benefit to achieve a minimum level of retirement preparedness, where the remaining portion of the account balance can be spent down over a period of time. That said, it's important to point out that the data really supports that education in any 3 of these facets has some pretty significant limits. If you go back to the Social Security Administration Office of Policy, very concerned about whether retirement education doesn't increase the likelihood that financially vulnerable groups will save their distributions. We have other data from the Journal of Public Economics that would support that peer behavior seems to be much more impactful on savings behavior than employee education. So we have no good metrics for, frankly, evaluating retirement readiness for the older population. I think the best metric is in looking at our workforce plan and are participants on average able to transition out in time. If they're not, then typically the problems lie in phases 1 and 2. We're not effectively, or were not at least 20 or 30 years ago, addressing the young saver population. B, the accumulator phase, we were not successful in maintaining low leakage levels, and therefore they didn't get the level of accumulation they wanted. Or C, and this happens frequently, and I think it will always happen in a defined contribution setting, is if we hire participants later in their careers, we had no control or participation in what their savings was coming into our organization, and we have to accept that that is a level of volatility that we're going to have to take on, and that they will be a part of the workforce longer. For that portion of the population, ultimately, once they hit whatever the typical workforce planning age may be, whether it's 65, 67, 68, or beyond, are they at least taking advantage of the catch-up contribution features that are available in our plan, so that at some point they'll be able to get themselves back to a place of retirement readiness that's adequate and works for them and their family. So we boiled it down to 5 metrics that plan sponsors can really quickly get an indication of plan health. The participation rate above 90%. 90% of our eligible participants are saving in the plan at some level. That we have a retirement contribution rate that's adequate to deliver retirement benefits to at least 75% of our population at a 90% profitability. So between match, grant contributions, profit sharing contributions, and deferrals, that contribution level is going to be adequate to get 75% of our workforce on pace to retire. That our eligible participants for the loan outstanding is less than 18%. That the average number of loans held by any participants with loans is under 1.5, and that the average loan balance for participants that have it as a percentage of their total account balance is less than 10%. It's important that we have these measures or metrics, and whether these metrics are perfectly situated for your organization or whether they need to be modified, tweaked, or added to is an important piece. You'll notice that I didn't talk about asset allocation in a defined contribution setting. Unlike a pension plan, asset allocation is managed by participants, and looking at it in aggregate, we can make some determinations. Looking at it individually, I think, is much more difficult to do. I think the same could be true on the fee side. Fees is largely a byproduct of the size of the plan clearly the degree to which that you as a plan sponsor can manage those metrics down. We spent long times in webinars talking about both of those topics. But these are 5 very fixable metrics for a retirement plan sponsor that can have a significant impact, far more significant than reducing plan expenses by another 2 or 3 basis points or improving marginally the asset allocation between stocks and bonds. So using that measuring of plan effectiveness is the first step to try and identify where are our obstacles. Do we have obstacles to participation, and how quickly can we remove them? How can we improve our deferral rates through automatic enrollment, auto-escalation, or re-enrollment if necessary to achieve better behavior? Where are there holes where participants are taking money out of the retirement plan prior to achieving retirement age, and how can we reduce that amount of leakage in aggregate? And then for that last portion of the population, providing resources and partnering with your service providers to deliver content-rich advice to the older population to help them begin to understand where they are in their retirement planning process so that we can start that cycle again. So with that, I'm going to open it up for some questions and give everybody a chance or two to, well, give me a chance to breathe for a second, and then give everybody else a chance to type out any questions that they may have about today's presentation. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody, as always, for attending today. Again, you will have an opportunity to receive these slides and a recorded version of the presentation for review and use at a future time. If you do have questions that may pop up later that you didn't have a chance to get addressed today, feel free to reach out to me directly, Eric, E-R-I-K, Daily, D-A-L-E-Y, at moltnomagroup.com. I'm happy to take those as well. And for those clients on the call, again, feel free to reach out directly to your consultants, and they'd be happy to help you with these issues as well. Thanks so much, and I hope everybody has a fantastic remainder to their day.